All right, I'm back. All right. I'm not sure how many lessons I'll get in, but I'm blessed and happy out. Actually, I was all prepped and ready to talk about something totally different today, and sort of continue where I left off the last time I spoke. But as like Pastor said, I was just sharing some other things. Like, well, if I had a little more time, there's another thing I would get into as well. And he's like, yeah, why don't you talk about that? And so we're going to get into that. But first, let me just recap a little bit of what we talked about last time when I was up here. And that is, we've been just going, obviously, we've been talking about shame for a few weeks. But it all stems from just the very beginning of everything. We were made to reflect God and glorify Him. We were made to honor Him. And it's in Him we get our honor. But we wanted that honor for ourselves. And that is what separated us from our source, the source of our honor. And that pride brought us shame. So first, our pride and sin brought shame upon all of humanity. It is just the universal human condition, is shame. It's that sense that when we look upon ourselves and we see our inadequacy, we see how we've fallen, we see our vulnerability, this shame comes in that tells us now we're unworthy of love. We're unworthy of connection with God. And that is a state that we are all in. And so what happens now, it leaves us striving for honor through our own human efforts. And it's usually by trying to elevate ourselves, or preserving ourselves, or protecting ourselves, what honor we already have, or trying to get more. Or, if that doesn't work, we try to do it by shaming others, putting others down. So we use King David as an example of this. It really was just a really good example of this whole dynamic of the relationship between pride and shame. And he started off life with no honor, but as he gained honor, both from God and as he was blessed, and then from others through his exploits, he became proud. So he started to take pride in the blessings. And his pride then brought shame when he sinned. And in his shame, though, when he recognized his sin, he became ashamed of himself. And he never, even though he became forgiven by God, once he confessed his sin, he stayed in shame. And in his shame, he did not walk in his identity. It kept him from fulfilling who he was as both a father and a king. So he allowed pride to grow in his sons. And their pride brought shame upon him and his daughter Tamar. And in this way, none of the characters in the story fulfilled their identities, fulfilled their callings. As we saw, that Absalom, whose name means the king's peace, he ended up bringing division. And Tamar, whose name means palm tree, which had the idea of fruitfulness, she never bore fruit because in her shame she never married. So she was so ashamed of herself, she isolated herself. So their names became these tragic ironies. And each of us have a name that God has given us, a calling He has given us. And when we are in shame, we don't fulfill those callings. So we see that different characters had shame for different reasons. Some because of their sin, and some because of the sin that was committed against them. And we see that some had objective shame, which is that shame that is, well, we'll get into that in a moment, but it's a shame that you should feel when you have violated the relationship in some way. And then some had subjective shame, which is from stigmatization, from rejection. Whether or not you should even have... There's people who had subjective shame, like Tamar, who shouldn't have felt shame at all. She did nothing wrong. She did not violate anything. And yet she felt shame. And then there's people who had objective shame. They actually violated the covenant, they violated a relationship, but they had no subjective shame. And you see that in Amnon and Absalom. They did wrong, they should have felt guilt, they should have felt shame, but they didn't feel anything. They were shameless in a dishonorable way. So that's a recap of what we got into last time. And the solution to it was in humility, that God began to restore David. Woo. It's all good, don't worry. God began to restore David as he began to accept who he was, and he acknowledged his own inadequacy, and he began to see himself through God's eyes more, who is willing to accept the truth. All right? So, like I said, I was going to continue with that thought, but no, I'd be remiss if I did not go into this next stuff. And so we're going to get into some secrets of shame. And I'm going to give away some of my secrets, okay? Some of my counseling secrets. I'm just going to give you guys stuff. I'm giving it away, so free of charge. But and as I'm doing this, with each message, I'm helping us hopefully construct a little bit of a framework and a lens for reading Scripture through the honor and shame narrative and context. Because the Scripture will come to light in a new way when you understand the culture in which the Bible was written and the way that the authors, the context in which they were writing it, and the way the audience was reading it and hearing it was in an honor-shame context, which is really the culture of the majority of the world. In the West, we have a hard time understanding, but we're growing more aware of the concept of honor and shame. I got into that a little bit last week, so bits and pieces I'll give. I'll probably get into that more the next time I get to speak. So first, we need to further develop our understanding of what shame is. Okay, we tend to talk about shame in more of a psychological sense, a very personal, individual, a subjective experience. It's based on an evaluation of your identity and your worth, and it becomes very individualized. And that's probably the main way that the West tends to think of shame. And this is all true, but we're missing a key piece if we want a complete understanding of shame. And that is that shame is rooted in relationship to others. That's how the majority world sees shame, which is made of honor-shame societies, like I've been saying. So, I want to get into a few points about that. Like I've already addressed, our first shame is from our disconnection with God. God made us to reflect Him. Not just, remember, God is in Himself a Trinity. That He is Himself a community of three persons, constantly in relationship and enjoying that relationship. And it's a joyful union. It's a loving relationship. And He made us in that image. So at our core, we are built for relationship. So when we disconnect from that, our first relationship is to God. And when there's a disconnect there because of sin, which is what we're all pretty much are just, doesn't matter which way you land on, either the Calvinism, Arminian, or what, we all believe we all have sinned, so it doesn't matter. Everyone has sinned, and everyone knows what it feels like to be disconnected from God. And that's our first source of shame. You see it right there in Adam and Eve. What happened when they sinned? They became aware of their nakedness. And in that means they became aware of their vulnerability and their imperfection. Or at least they perceived themselves as imperfect. But they became at least aware of their vulnerability and the risk that they were at in walking around without protection and to cover themselves up. So their first reaction was to hide. They tried to hide from God. How do you hide from God? They quickly learned you can't do that. Try hiding in some bushes. But that's what we all do. We use more technology now. We'll get into that in a bit. So the first reaction is they felt shame and they tried to hide from God. So then, now humanity separated from God, we now form our own societies. And we have our own relationships. We have our vertical relationship with God that's now been severed, and then we have our horizontal relationships with everyone else. And then we split those up into little groups, and we try to get honor through those groups. This is how an honor-shame society understands things, that your honor is from inclusion in the group and feeling accepted. Because honor itself means the group's recognition of your worth. That's how honor is. It's not something you just give yourself, I have honor. You don't just psych yourself up. It's something that you are bestowed. So, but then we bring more shame upon ourselves when we break relational connection with others. And so we strive to gain honor and avoid shame. Now, we do that through three main ways. There's three main sources of either honor or shame. First is purity and cleanliness versus impurity and defilement. When you understand that concept, it really helps make more sense when you read some of those purity laws in the Old Testament, like Leviticus. It's like those were meant to keep them pure and separate. It wasn't always about the cotton or the linen. It was meant to symbolize purity. So, a little tidbit there. So, what purity was is the cultural evaluation of your appropriateness, which could be based on sin. You know, how moral you were, if you kept the law, if you were righteous, then that meant you were pure in some way. But it could also be based on things like our looks, based on if you had some sort of imperfection, defect, things you couldn't help. You see this as a... Now, there's some aspects of these honor-shame societies that have things right, and other aspects where they got them wrong. And when you understand the gospel, Jesus comes in, for sure. Almost happened again. and he's like, all right, I'm going to work with the culture, but there's some ways I got to correct you. All right? But you see that in some societies to this day, where some women may rather risk being abused than to be exposed and shown that they were abused. So they'll endure the pain. I'll get into that probably in a little bit more in depth with an example of a client I have. So sometimes we'll endure all sorts of hardship if it means that if we can keep it secret so they won't experience the shame of being disconnected from the group. Another thing that they look at is faithfulness and loyalty to the group, and to the relationship, versus being unfaithful and disloyal and being a traitor. Those are things that bring shame. And the other one is strength. Strength that is used not to honor yourself, because if you use strength to just benefit yourself, then that's actually shameful. But strength that is used to benefit others. And that's the idea of patronage that we got into last time. Whereas being weak and being dependent is considered shameful. Having nothing to offer anyone, being the one who's always asking, can usually be a source of shame. So we see as honor leads to acceptance and group inclusion. Shame leads to rejection and group exclusion. Okay, so some categories or some things to think about when it comes to what Scripture talks about in honor and shame. Now, I mentioned that there's two types of shame. There's objective shame, which I mentioned is the legitimate shame that we should feel when we've broken relationship, particularly with God. When you're aware of your depravity, that is normal to experience some shame over it. Now, you shouldn't stay there because God has a solution for that. But that is a normal response. It's a shame we should feel because we were disloyal to God, that we didn't honor Him, and we were defiled by our sin. Scripture understands there's a relationship between sin and shame. It's, like we said, sin is what caused the very first shame, and then in shame, it leads to more sin. And sin leads to more shame. It just perpetuates itself. Like we got into with the story of David, is in shame, sin was committed that brought shame upon the sinner and upon other people. And then in their shame, they kept sinning as well. And we're going to get into a little bit about how shame causes us to sin, and shame keeps us in our sin. Then there's subjective shame, and that is just this feeling and belief caused by the social stigma and rejection. But not even necessarily to actually be rejected, but sometimes just to be afraid of being rejected is enough to cause shame. There's times where I'm talking to someone and they'll avoid certain things even though they've never actually done those things and experienced the rejection from that, but they're just anticipating. Or they've gone through something and they would never tell anyone what they've gone through because they're anticipating if they reveal this, then they'll be rejected. So the subjective shame isn't always based on something that's actually happened. Sometimes just we've grown up, maybe even just with our parents, we see what has caused shame in their life or other people we love. We see what has brought rejection to them. And so we're making notes. We're like, okay, I'm going to avoid that. And I'm going to avoid revealing things that show that I'm vulnerable and weak. So as I usually explain to clients, is shame is like a type of super category. It's out of that most of our negative emotions just grow and they spurt out, and that is sort of the ultimate source of it. And because we are made for relationship, the feeling of shame and rejection, it's rooted in disconnection, relational disconnection. The feelings that come from are the most distressing and painful feelings. We would rather endure all sorts of pain than to experience shame. So, like as an example, this is not a PG or a G-rated sermon right now, but one of the clients I'm working with at Valley Forge at the university is one of the girls there who, the reason why she started to see me was because she was sexually assaulted on campus. And it was right in the library, sitting at a table doing homework with another classmate that she thought was safe. And he started coming on to her. Guess what? There were other people in the library. Now, he was putting his hand down her pants, and probably others couldn't see. She kept telling him no, but he kept doing it. But there are other people in the library. She could have called out to them for help, but she didn't. Why? Shame. Because it would have embarrassed her for them to notice what was happening. We would rather endure being abused and hurt than to be embarrassed and shamed. And you see that in other cultures still. But we don't acknowledge it enough in the West, but it's still here. And so this guy was able to get away with something that probably someone else, if they knew was happening, would have stepped up and would have defended her honor. But she was so full of shame over that, she didn't use her voice. So I want to get into something that is the aspect of shame that there's a few concepts I go into with my clients, and there's two. I'm going to get into this first one, and this is how shame leads us into sin. And then we use these sins on a habitual basis. That is the addiction cycle. This is actually in particular, the sexual addiction cycle. This was developed by Patrick Carnes, but it's really true of all addictions. And shame is at the base, or really at the top. And as I've been saying, the emotions of shame are so distressing that we just want relief. It's so painful when you're experiencing shame. And it isolates you so much that you're disconnected from others, and that brings so much more pain. And so we want relief. And what we're going to go to is, by default, whatever experience or action or behavior or drug that we encode in our memory as being pleasurable, as bringing some sort of relief. Okay? Now, we don't just choose whatever sin we use on a regular basis by accident. For most of us, whatever sin you're stuck in that you've been using on a regular, you've been using since childhood. And maybe it's changed a bit, but it's only gotten more, you got savvier with it, you're adding more technology to it. You know, but at the root, it's something we've learned early on. All right, so let me explain that a little bit, okay? With brain development, your brain develops from the bottom up, okay? And it starts with your limbic system, which is your emotional control center, all right? And one of the first things that develops, like, this is probably being generous, but by age 3, that part of your brain is done cooking. Whereas the higher part of your brain, cerebral cortex and the prefrontal cortex, those parts that help you think through things and plan out your decisions better and use better decision-making skills, that's not finished till your mid-20s. So what happens early on is you're so vulnerable to making bad decisions. And what happens is when you experience something pleasurable at a young age, your brain just codes that and be like, oh, if it feels good, it must be good for me. Because your brain only cares about one thing, survival. Keeping you alive and healthy or whatever. it doesn't know if it's moral or not. It doesn't care. That's why you need good parents. And so at a younger age, restrict the child, and then as they get older, help them make good decisions so that they're prepared for all the different temptations that are out there. But at a young age, you're vulnerable to things that will actually lead you down a bad road. But at the time, you just know it felt good. So at an early age, you experience something that, okay, this brought relief. Okay, this could be anything. This could be like, okay, I know that when I'm upset, if I throw a tantrum, that makes me feel better. Do you grow out of that? Not really, it just gets more sophisticated sometimes. Or it gets more violent. I'll fight my brothers. And then what happens when you get older? Now when you fight, you're actually breaking things. Or I know that, okay, when there's pain and there's anguish at home and there's turmoil at home, it feels better at least when I avoid it all. So I'm going to default to that. But then when you can't always avoid everything, what we use some alcohol. We use some other drugs to help us avoid things. Because we can't just do it on our own, so we need more technology. That's what drugs are. It's just more man-made methods to help get the same effect that we were trying to go for when we were younger. So it's no accident. Whatever sin you've been using on a regular basis started at an early age. It's something that you learned to help deal with life. And whatever brought the most pleasure or most relief is what you're going to go back to most. And even though later on you learn that, no, this is actually morally wrong, I shouldn't be doing this thing, that part of you that encoded it doesn't care. It's just going to go to it. So when you need relief later, your limbic system just goes straight to that thing. All right? So the first thing that happens is that shame it trips down. And the first thing that's going to bring us some relief is what we call preoccupation. That just means you're thinking about it. I'm going to think about that thing that brings me relief. If I'm working with guys with sexual addiction, they're going to think about, okay, I'm going to think about this girl at work. Or I'm going to think about this movie I'm going to watch later. I'm going to go on Netflix and chill some. They're thinking about something that's going to bring them some pleasure. If you're dealing with a guy with alcohol issues, he's thinking about, all right, after this shift, I am going to hit the bar. And he's just thinking about it. And just doing that releases some endorphins, and that feels good. But that's not enough. So then he's going to think about, okay, how am I going to actually act this out? So then we go through the rituals. Okay? Like I was just explaining this a couple weeks ago to a new client of mine at day 7, the one counseling practice I'm at. And he's a returning client. He saw someone else for a couple years, a few years ago. And so he's returned, he's got me now. And first he was coming in for like pornography addiction issues, but now he's dealing with that still, but to a lesser extent. Now his main thing is food addiction. And so I'm like, did your previous therapist, did he go over the addiction cycle with you? And he's like, no. So I start walking him through this. And with the ritual stage, those are the steps and the patterns you go through to then act out. And so I'm like, here's some scenarios maybe. You're thinking about, okay, after work, I'm going to leave work a little early, and I'm going to hit up that, I got cravings for some Popeyes. I'm going to make sure I go down this road, because that's where the Popeyes is. I'm going to go there earlier, and I'm going to make sure I can eat it on the way home, so I get home and wife won't even know I ate anything. And he's like, yes, exactly. That's exactly what I've done. I've done those exact things. And I'm like calling it out. I'm like, all right, I'll bet this also happens. You get some extra bucks. You sort of give your wife some, but you keep some for yourself. So you got some spending money for at work. You can get some more junk food. Yup, exactly. We got these rituals we go through. They can take a moment. They can take months. Maybe your way of acting out is you're going to have an affair. And it takes you months to groom that person that you know to lead to the affair. Or it could just take you a moment. All right, after this, I'm going to go to the bathroom, get my phone with me, and look up some porn. All right? Those are the rituals. Once you start that process, you're sort of on a train. You're on a chain reaction, and it's hard to just get off that. Because it'll lead to acting out. Now, here's what happens. People in addiction, they'll know when they acted out. They'll be like, what just happened? Here, I got this issue. I'm trying to work on it. And all of a sudden, I just acted out. I don't know what happened. It just happened. They're not aware of the prior stages. They're not aware of the shame at the root of it. They're not aware of how they were thinking about it all day, or weeks before something, and they're not aware of the rituals and the steps they took to get there. They just know they suddenly acted out. And all that does is feed this idea that they're deeply flawed and that they can't change because they just messed up again. No matter how hard I try, I keep going back to this thing. And so what happens? That brings despair. Because they failed again on something that they're trying to work through. But also, because the high they got from acting out, it only lasts a moment. And it brings them right back down. So that despair then adds to their shame. And the cycle just continues. Until the shame builds up more, and they just act out again. Despair just helps reinforce the idea. There's no hope. You're just going to keep acting up. So you're going to keep going down this path. So what we have actually is a war on two fronts. When I help the client strategize, it's like, okay, we need to do a couple things. Is get some barriers in place and obstacles for each of those steps. You need a barrier that keeps you from going to the preoccupation stage, where you start thinking about acting out. You need some other strategies to start thinking about other things, to reframe what it is you're tempted by, and be like, whoa, hey, I'm tempted right now to do this. The reason why is because of this. And you got to reframe it, take some of the power away from it. Think of some other things. Contact someone. Hey, I'm really tempted right now. I want to go act out. There's different steps you can take, different obstacles you can put in place to keep you from going to the next stage. Once you're in the ritual stage, that gets a little harder to keep yourself from acting out once you start those rituals. But it's possible. You got to come with some obstacles. If you've got a porn addiction, get an accountability software, a blocks on your phone, on your computers. Like, come on, there's technology out there. So many, like, and parents, please, you got kids, assume they're going to run across this stuff. Just get the blocks on your phones and on your computers. Little tidbit. Put the blocks on there. Make it hard. Make it so you're going to have to put some effort in. Because once we get into this, we get in these ruts, it doesn't take a lot of effort to act out. So you got to make it so, all right, it's going to take some more work. And sometimes our laziness as humans wins out. Sometimes I don't want to do all this work. But usually, when the temptation is strong enough, we'll do what we got to do. A lot of times, one thing I say to my clients is, if you got time to watch porn, you got time to pray. You got time to go do that. You got time to seek God. You got time to go contact your accountability partners, your support group, to go work out, to do something more healthy for yourself. So one thing they always say, I don't have time. I don't have time to do these healthy things for me. No, you got time for that. You got time for this. So you need to put in the barriers. And there's even a barrier to put in place for after you act out to keep it from going to despair. And that's the one that confuses people. Like, how do you put a barrier in place from that? Don't you just automatically feel despair? Don't you automatically feel like you're terrible? It's like, even in your sin, you can turn to God and receive from Him the grace and forgiveness you need so that it doesn't lead to more hopelessness. It's remember the guilt. Remember to transfer from feeling shame to now guilt. Like, actually, I've just messed up. But it doesn't mean that I'm totally messed up. So I can confess my sin, receive His forgiveness, and make things right and work. I can learn something from this mess up. When you have more of a guilt base for this, then you will actually realize you can learn from all your screw-ups. So that's the addiction cycle. The other thing I go over with people is the assertion versus shame self-state model. And this is something I learned from Joseph Nicolosi. He's the founder of Reparative therapy, which you probably have heard of this as, this is a therapy for people with unwanted same-sex attraction. And so it's primarily used for people with homosexuality. What we've come to learn is it's not just for that. It works as a model for people with addiction, with trauma, just other repetitive sin behaviors. So I looked at it like, wait a second, I started to learn some things from this, and like, wait, this is sort of like my addiction cycle that I've been learning, just sort of linear in some ways. And what you see first is different self-states. These are states of mind, states of being in the world. The first one right there to the left is assertion. Okay? that is a state of where you are now feeling confident in yourself. You're able to feel your emotions. You're able to work through conflicts. You're getting your needs met. Now why? Because you understand that you're worth it. You see your value. So it's worth it for you to assert yourself at times, to get your needs met in healthy ways. You're resilient. You're able to handle difficulties. That's the state of assertion. That's where you want to stay. In the state of assertion, you're not tempted to sin. When you're fully connected to God and with others in community, you have intimate relationships and relationships at different levels of belonging, you're not tempted. But what happens sometimes is a trigger will come up, or some sort of experience or event or interaction with someone will pop up and may bring us into shame. It may be something that exposes something that deep down we still have to keep working through. It could be that, I'm feeling pretty good at myself, did a good job on this paper, this assignment, bring it in, an F? What? I thought I was doing well. Your belief about yourself just now gets crumbled. What? Now that shame you have, that you've thought you've worked through, or that maybe you're still avoiding in some ways of being inadequate and not good enough, now comes up. And then you could end up in the shame state. And in that shame state, we have all the other stuff that we have when we're in shame, the negative emotions. But also the shame state puts us in a false self. One of our main reactions when we're in shame is to wear a mask and to hide. So we put on a false self. I'm going to act like I'm better than I actually am. I'm going to present myself differently. That whole false self, actually, what I would say, that is really the key to understanding the whole trans phenomenon. This idea of being someone you're not, it just shows how it's the epitome or the height of human shame. That we're so ashamed of who you are, you're going to be someone else. And it's not just transgender now, we got trans racism, you got trans species, trans ableism. You're just ashamed of who you are, that you're putting on a false self. It's usually unconscious, they don't know what they're doing, but it just shows you how ashamed they are. Which should also show us what these people dealing with this issue need is not more shame and condemnation, but more connection and love and gentle correction in a good community. So, what happens then in shame? The negative emotions from shame get so overwhelming that it leads to the gray zone. And gray zone means that now those negative emotions, they shut off. You disconnect from those negative emotions. And you sort of just feel apathetic. Like, I don't feel anything anymore. And when I learned this, it's made perfect sense. It's like the light went off for me. Because for years in my group, I'd work with guys, and we'd go over our accountability part, and I asked them, okay, how did you act out this week or whatever? And one of them would share, and I usually would ask, okay, what were you feeling when you acted out? And use that to sort of analyze things a bit. And he would say sometimes, like, well, I felt nothing. Like, come on, you had to feel something. What'd you feel? And he's like, no, I just felt apathetic. I didn't feel anything. And when I learned it made sense, because what happens is those negative emotions from the shame just get so overwhelming you can't handle it anymore. And so you just disconnect from those emotions. It's a form of dissociation. Now, he was feeling something, but it was probably days prior, maybe even weeks prior, and he was just stuck in this gray zone for a while. And it's out of the gray zone that we then act out. Because what it also does is shuts down your emotions, but also shuts down your inhibition. And so now you don't have anything holding you back from then acting out. Now, some people don't just get to the gray zone on their own. They need drugs and alcohol to get there. So they're so full of shame and it's overwhelming, so they numb the emotions through alcohol or some drugs. And then they're in the gray zone. And then when they're in the gray zone, they either keep drinking or whatever, they just go on a really bad binge and just keeps a bender and just keeps going on, or it leads to some other form of acting out. Once you're in that gray zone, it's really hard to get out. So you sort of find a way to get back up and come back to assertion or sort of pick up the pieces a bit. does anyone here watch This Is Us? It's a show on NBC. It's like Jess and mine. It's like one of our favorite shows. And there's a recent episode from a couple weeks ago that perfectly illustrates this. So there's this main character, Kevin, who he is in drug and alcohol recovery. And he's doing pretty good. He's feeling really good about himself. And he discovers his long-lost uncle that they thought was dead from Vietnam. And they find out he's still alive. And their dad had died years ago, and their dad who died had told them that his brother had died in the war. And then he discovers he's still alive. So they go on a road trip to go meet him, and he's pumped. He's in that state of assertion. He's feeling positive, he's feeling confident, he's eager to connect with this long-lost uncle and maybe help him in some way. And they find him, the guy's just broken, and he's an alcoholic, and doesn't want the help. And they learn the story about what happened, and you see it happening in Kevin, where now he's in his uncle's trailer while his uncle's somewhere else with his mom, and he goes back to the trailer, and he's there, and you just see now he's dejected. He's feeling disconnected. He was in a state of assertion, but now he's in a state of shame. Because now he's disconnected from who he thought his dad was. His dad, who was always perfect, lied to them about their uncle. And he was so eager to connect with his uncle, and his uncle doesn't want any help. So he's feeling worthless. He's feeling like he can't be of any help. And what does he see on the table? A bottle of whiskey. And you see it happen, and he goes for the whiskey. I'm like, oh, no, don't. But he does. Because the shame was so overwhelming, he got into the gray zone, and he was vulnerable to acting out. And he drank away his sobriety in that moment. And he's riding back home with his mom, and she's telling him, I'm so proud of you. She doesn't know what he just did, but you can see in his face he's just full of shame. And so what does he do? He's back in the false self. He's presenting an image that he's still okay. He's trying to, but he's really full of shame of what he just did. There's times too, when I'm talking with clients, and I'm just explaining this concept to them, and I'll ask them, what's it feel like, to try to give you some ideas, like, when you're in that state of assertion. And sometimes I get a client, and he's like, I have no idea. I've never been in that state. I've grown up feeling ashamed of myself. I never was told I'm valuable or that I'm loved. They don't even have that experience to draw upon. And in my sessions, it's to help build up something that was never even there. So, as a little side note, if you hear things about reparative therapy that help for people with homosexuality is to help them by shaming them and torturing them, you know right away that the person saying that doesn't know what the heck they're talking about. Because what actually happens is we're helping them work through the emotional roots and work through the shame. Now, what happens when you counter one of those interactions, one of those triggers that can help bring you into a shame state? There's two things you could do. There's the top way, which is use some coping skills. All right? You get that F on the paper. What you can do? Okay, I guess I wasn't as good as I thought I was, but that's okay. I'm capable of doing better. I'm going to study harder. Or, all right, I guess I'm not as good as this topic as I thought I was. And that's okay. And you learn to accept it, and you can move on from it. You can work through it. You can use some mental skills. You're like, all right, I'm just going to spend some time with my friends, my family, people who love me, and just be connected again and be restored, and that'll get me back to the assertion state. But sometimes that thing that gets triggered is so deep, the wound is so deep, that that's not good enough. So you go the bottom way, and that is grief. Sometimes you just have to grieve that wound. And it's a painful process, because you got to allow yourself to feel all the emotions. The anger, the pain. You got to feel it. And you got to walk through it with other people who will love you, and not try to force you to move through it too quickly, and just be there with you. But when you come out the other side, it brings more resilience. And your assertion state will be even stronger than before. Because I can work through this. I've been healed of that wound. So that's the bottom way. It's the harder way, but it's the longer term way. So that's what that model is I explain to people. I explain both these models sort of side to side. It's funny because we talked about me going over this stuff, and literally yesterday with my client, I was explaining this stuff to him. This is one of the most regular things I explain to people, and I get super pumped when I talk about them because it's just, when you understand these dynamics, it gives you some hope. There's hope of change and freedom.
Amen.
So these are some of the ways that shame keeps us in sin. Because once you're in that shame state, you can't see a way out sometimes. It keeps you in the sin. Shame will make you start to sin, and then it'll keep you there with that cycle. Oh, I'm not good enough. And you know, every time you keep backing out, there's more evidence that, yep, I'm flawed, I'm defective, I'm unchangeable, and therefore I'm unlovable. So I got to keep this secret. I got to keep this to myself. I can't let other people know. It just gets worse and worse. It just keeps building. Yep, that's it. These are ways, and then the lie that shame communicates is that you're flawed. And if others knew about this flaw, they would reject you. And so shame demands that we hide and wear masks. And not just wear masks so others can't see our source of shame, we wear masks so that we can't see our source of shame. That's denial. So many people who have shame, and they don't even want to see it themselves. They avoid it like crazy. And by holding on to shame, we believe not only that we're deeply flawed and unacceptable, but also that we're unchangeable, like I've been saying. So why bother trying? And so I'm going to tease you guys with this. I'm going to probably talk about this more the next time I speak. And this is all the reason why, when we as believers still sin, we're having an identity crisis. You're forgetting who you are, or you're viewing yourself either in shame or in pride, but it's not viewing yourself the way God views you, and the way that you're not seeing your relationship with Him the way it actually is. So whenever we sin, as believers, it's because we're having an identity crisis. But see, by hiding, we actually create another problem. Shame grows in secret. In Ephesians, it says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for it is light that makes everything visible. This is why it is said, 'Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" It's Ephesians 5, 8-14. So what we need to do when we're experiencing shame is actually the opposite of what shame demands we do. Act opposite. It's a slogan from DBT, Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. Is act opposite. Whatever that negative emotion tells you to do, when depression tells you isolate yourself, withdraw from others. When shame says hide who you are. What the key is actually expose who you are. Reveal. As it says in James, is confess your sins. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise him up. If he has sinned, he will be forgiven. If he has sinned, what? Will he maybe get forgiven? Will he maybe get rejected instead? No, he will be forgiven. Therefore, so it's based on that. It's based on the fact that we have that forgiveness guaranteed to us. Based on that, confess your sins one to another and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. It's James 5, 15-16. Now those passages might just terrify you. Like, I am not going to reveal this thing I'm ashamed of. I'm going to keep this to my grave. No one needs to know. Man, the freedom that you can live in. I was getting into this a bit when we were doing our masculinity course. And I was pretty open in that class, revealing some of my own struggles and my own history of certain things. And even in doing that, there was a little moment where I was like, ooh, should I have said that? Did that reveal it too much? And I remind myself, in the moment, I'm doing this mental game, and I'm like, no, I need to show that it's okay to be real. And I made a decision a long time ago when I started leading a group at Valley Forge, was I would never ask a client or a guy in my group a question I wasn't willing to answer myself. So there's times I ask them probing questions, and if they're not willing to answer, I'll be the one. I'll show you that it's safe to do it. I'll put myself out there sometimes to show that it's actually okay. Because guess what? When you're free of shame, you're unstoppable.
Amen.
You can't be held back. When you're actually free of that fear of being exposed and being rejected, nothing can hold you back anymore. Then you can love with true boldness. You can reach out to people that might reject you, and it won't matter to you because you're doing it not for yourself. You're doing it for them and to glorify God. You can use your gifts and not be worried if you fail, because the glory doesn't come from you. It comes from God.
Hallelujah.
Amen.
So when you're free of that shame, you can't be stopped. The enemy hates it when we're free of shame. He wants you to stay in shame. Like we've been talking about, Satan plays a two-part game. He will tempt us to sin, and then once we sin, he'll condemn us. If we knew it was him the whole time, wouldn't we be like, wait a second, didn't you tell me to do that? And you're trying to put me down for doing it? I'm on to you now. If we were aware of his schemes, you got to pay attention. What is it that God has been delivering you from your whole life? What is it that you've been struggling with your whole life? That's a scheme the enemy's going to use. All right? So, now we're not finished yet, so don't just take what I've said and run with it totally yet. We've got more we're going to get into. I don't want you to start like, all right, I'm going to start sharing everything about myself willy-nilly. And, well, all right, there's some more healing that might have to happen first, and there's some groundwork that has to happen because there's a few things I want you to consider first, all right? Because over the next couple of weeks, Pastor and I, we're going to be sharing with you some truths about who you are, about who God is, and his relationship to you. But our hearts need to be prepared in order to receive these truths. All right, so number one, the question you need to settle is, whose words about me matter most? Others, my own, or God's? Whenever I talk about identity stuff with people, I tell them, like, I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of awesome stuff that God says about you. But until you care more about what God says than anyone else, including yourself, these things I'm going to tell you aren't going to make a difference in your life. So it's kind of dangerous to learn things if you're not ready to receive them. It just becomes knowledge and we take it for granted. But when your heart is ready, you receive it. I remember that moment when I started to understand who I am in Christ. Man, you couldn't take that joy away from me. And you can tell me, oh no, I know it's God. What he says matters most. I can tell what you really believe by your actions, not by your words. I can see if you're still acting out in shame. I can still, if you're going and trying to act to preserve yourself and just take care of number one, and if you're protecting yourself and you're not actually reaching out and doing vulnerable things and loving others, you're still relying on yourself. So it's going to be a process. Don't expect change overnight. It takes time. All right, but that's the question you need to be settling in your heart. Whose words matter most to me? You can't fake it either. You can't go, no, I believe it says, yeah, I'm gonna muscle through it. No, you can't fake it. You gotta believe it deep down. It's gonna take time sometimes. We got such deep wounds. We have distrust of God sometimes because of things that we've gone through, ways people have hurt us. We have a hard time believing that he actually cares for us and loves us. All right? So that's one thing for us to remember. The other thing is, for everyone else, if shame and guilt are not such big issues for you, one, you might be in denial. Two is, if it's true, if you've actually been working through this stuff well enough, then you actually have an important responsibility. All right? Don't check out. Be like, all right, I can't wait for this series to be done. Nah. You actually, like that addiction cycle stuff I just went through and the shame self-state, you're like, well, I don't deal with this stuff. I don't need to know about this. Yes, you do. If not for yourself, then for someone else. That God is going to put in your life for you to care for them and show them God's face. So you have a responsibility. We as a church have a responsibility to make this community a safe refuge for people to expose their shame and find healing. What it just said in James. Confess your sins, then you'll be healed. How many times have we confessed sins and not been healed? And instead we're condemned and rejected. So we need to be doing the work. All of this what we're planning to do with starting to activate our gifts will be for nothing if we don't have love. So you need to be asking yourself, am I safe? Do I treat people that the world may reject, or that even me and my flesh may want to reject? Do I treat these people with honor, with dignity, with respect? Do I treat them like they have worth and value? Am I willing to associate with them? Or I want to avoid them like the plague? And say I love them from afar. Am I willing to go into the dirt with some people? Have true compassion on them? So 1 Corinthians 12 is going to help plug your Bible study you'll be doing, Mike. 1 Corinthians 12, 21, 26. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts, the ones that are pretty good, don't have to worry about them as much. They need no special treatment. But God has combined all the members of the body and has given greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for one another. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. That's the attitude we need. And if you're dealing with the shame, the healing isn't just for you. God started working on me when I was a senior in high school with this stuff. I was coming from depression and loneliness. I was in that shame for years. And God started working on me. At my last year of high school, I really started building me up from the inside. And I know now that it wasn't just for me.
Amen.
God knew I'd be working with people with deep shame. I'd be married with a wife with some shame. So you got to get your act together. God's like, all right, it's time. You got to get some stuff together here. You got to start dealing with this shame because it's not just about you. I got people I want to use you to help heal. You can't just be thinking of yourself and preserving yourself and protecting yourself. It's time to get your stuff together because there's a world out there that needs some healing.
Amen.
So some few thoughts I want to leave us with. All right, this stuff is important. All right. That's about all I got for right now.
Thank you.